Welcome to Understand the Math. In this video, I'm going to teach you all about how to factor quadratic equations. We're going to go over 4 factoring techniques, and for each of these techniques, I've written out steps that you can follow, and then I'll walk you through examples so that you can see how to do these step by step. Let's start by solving quadratic equations by factoring out what's called the greatest common factor. We're going to solve the quadratic equation ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. And in the examples that I'm going to show you, the c term, that's the constant term by itself, is equal to 0. So essentially what we're going to be solving is the equation ax squared plus bx is equal to 0. When we have equations like that, what we're going to do is we're going to factor out the greatest common factor. That's just the largest factor that both terms share. I'll show you exactly how this works. Let's look at our first example. I'm going to begin by writing down our problem. We have 2x squared plus 8x is equal to 0. We're going to factor out the greatest common factor. So we're going to look at both of these terms and find the largest factor that both of them share. We can see that both of them share a 2, so we're going to pull the 2 out, and then both of them have an x, so we're going to pull an x out. So the 2x is what's called our greatest common factor. And then we're going to put a parenthesis, and then we have to see what's left over. So we're going to look at the 2x squared, we're going to take out a 2x, and we have an x left over. And then we're going to look at the 8x. After we pull out a 2x, we're going to have a 4 left over. So we have a plus 4. Now we're going to have 2 solutions. Our first solution is going to be when 2x is equal to 0, or our second solution is going to be when x plus 4 is equal to 0. Now we'll go ahead and solve both of those. On the left-hand side, we're going to divide by 2. And we end up with x is equal to 0. And then on the right, we're going to move the 4 to the right-hand side. So we'll subtract 4 from both sides. And we get x is equal to minus 4. Our solution is then x is equal to 0 or x is equal to minus 4. Let's do another one just so that you can get more practice. You may want to pause the video and see if you can do this one on your own. I bet you can. I'm going to begin by writing down our equation. We have 3x squared minus 15x is equal to 0. We're going to factor out the greatest common factor. So notice that we have a 3 common to both terms, and we have an x common to both terms. So we're going to factor out a 3x, and then what's left is an x minus 3 goes into 15 5 times, so we have a 5 left. And that's equal to 0. Now we have 2 equations that are going to be equal to 0. We have 3x is equal to 0, or we have x minus 5 is equal to 0. On the left, we'll divide both sides by 3, and we get x is equal to 0. Or on the right, we're going to add 5 to both sides, and we get x is equal to 5. Our 2 solutions then are x is equal to 0 or x is equal to 5. Hopefully you have the hang of this now. Let's now look at a different factoring technique. The factoring technique that we're going to look at now is called factoring by trial and error. I think one of the hardest things about factoring quadratic equations is trying to figure out what method to use. So here's a guideline that you can use for this one. When you solve ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, and a, which is the constant that multiplies x squared, if it's equal to 1, factoring by trial and error is a really good method to start with. Essentially, what we're going to be solving when our a is equal to 1 is x squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to find 2 numbers that multiply to get c, that's our constant term, and then add up to get b, that's the constant that multiplies the x. Let's see how this works. In our first example, we're going to be solving x squared plus 7x plus 12 is equal to 0. We need to find two terms that multiply to get c. Our c is equal to 12, so I'm going to write down 12. And we need two numbers that multiply to get 12. I'm going to be very systematic about this, and I'm going to start with 1. So the numbers 1 and 12 multiply to get 12. And then I'm going to go to 2. 2 goes into 12 6 times, so 2 times 6 is equal to 12. And then I'm going to go to 3. 3 times 4 is equal to 12, so we have numbers 3 and 4. 4 we already have, and that means that we can go ahead and stop. So these are the numbers that we're going to pick from. And now we want to find which two of these numbers add up to get b. So when you look at these numbers, you can see that 3 plus 4 is going to equal 7. So 3 and 4 are going to be our factors. We can then write our equation in factored form as x plus 3 and x plus 4. And that's equal to 0. We'll then solve our two equations. Our first equation is x plus 3 is equal to 0, or our other equation is x plus 4 is equal to 0. Let's solve the equation on the left first. We're going to subtract 3 from both sides, and we get x is equal to minus 3. You can probably do that in your head. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the right. I'm going to subtract 4, and we get x is equal to minus 4. And I'm going to put our or in here. And then let's highlight our answers. Our answers are x is equal to minus 3 or x is equal to minus 4. Let's now try another one. You may want to pause the video and see if you can try this one on your own. We are going to solve x squared minus 5x minus 36 is equal to 0. This one's a little bit harder than the last one because 36 is bigger than the number we had in our first example. I think we had a 12, and it's also negative. We want to begin by finding two numbers that multiply to get minus 36. So I'm going to write down minus 36, and I'm going to start with 1. So we have 1 and minus 36. And then on the right, I'm also going to make a note that we could have also written this as minus 1 and 36. Those are also two numbers that multiply to get minus 36. Now let's go ahead and let's go to number 2. So we'll write down 2. 2 goes into 36 18 times. So we're going to write minus 18. And then on the right, we're going to do minus 2 and 18. Now let's go to 3. 3 goes into 36 12 times. So we have a 3 and a minus 12. And then on the right, we have a minus 3 and 12. And then does 4 go into 36? Yes, it does. So let's write down 4. 4 times 9 is 36, so we have a minus 9. And then on the right, we have a minus 4 and a 9. 5 doesn't go into 36. 6 does go into 36, so we'll write that down. So we have a 6 and a minus 6, and we don't need to write minus 6 and 6 because that's already written down. And then 7 doesn't go in. 8 does not go in. 9 we already have, that's right here. So we can go ahead and stop. Now what we need to do is we need to find two of these numbers that we've already written down that add up to get minus 5. So let's look at this. If we go through these one by one, we get to this one, and those are the two numbers that add up to get minus 5. So those are going to be our factors. And we can now write our equation in factored form as x plus 4 and x minus 9. Set that equal to 0. We end up with x plus 4 is equal to 0, or x minus 9 is equal to 0. So on the left, we're going to subtract 4 from both sides. I'm not going to write that down this time. And we get x is minus 4. And on the right, we're going to add 9 to both sides, and we get x is equal to 9. We'll put a little or here. And let's go ahead and highlight our answers. Our answers are x is equal to minus 4 or x is equal to 9. I want to make a note before we go on that once you get used to doing a lot of these problems, you probably will not need to write all of this down. You can probably just do that in your head. But when you're first starting, it's often helpful to go ahead and write it down. Let's now look at another factoring technique. The factoring technique that we're going to look at now is called factoring by grouping. Factoring by grouping is a good technique to use when you're solving ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, and a, that's the term that multiplies your x squared, is not equal to 1. This is a little bit more complicated, so you can see we have 4 steps that we can follow. I always like writing down steps for students because I think it helps them organize their thoughts and know what to do next. Since we have 4 steps, I'm not going to go over them ahead of time. We're just going to walk through them as we do an example. The example that we're going to look at is where we're going to solve 2x squared plus 7x plus 3 is equal to 0. The first step that we're going to do, and that's up above here, so let me highlight this. That's this step up here. We're going to find 2 numbers that multiply to get AC and then add to get B. Let's begin by writing down what AC is. A times C is the constant that multiplies your x squared times your constant that's all by itself. In our problem, this is going to be 2 times 3 is equal to 6. So we're going to need 2 numbers that multiply to get 6. Let's write down what these can be. We'll start and be systematic and start with 1, so we can have 1 and 6. And then let's go to 2. We can have 2 and 3. They multiply to get 6. And then the next number is 3. We already have that, so we can stop. Now we need to look at this and see which 2 of these numbers add up to be the constant in our middle term, and that's 7. And we can see that 1 plus 6 is equal to 7. So those are going to be the numbers that we're going to use in our next step. Our second step, and I'll highlight this up here, is to rewrite bx using these 2 numbers. Let's go ahead and let's do that. We have 2x squared, and then our bx is our 7x. Let me circle that. That's this right here. We're going to rewrite that using 1 and 6. So instead of 7x, we're going to write it as 1x, which is just x, plus 6x. And then our 3 comes along for the ride, and that's equal to 0. Now let's go ahead and let's go to our third step. Our third step says that we're going to group the first 2 terms together, and then group the last 2 terms together, and then we'll factor out the greatest common factor. Let's do our grouping first. I'm going to put a parenthesis around our first 2 terms and then around our last 2 terms. And then there's our 0. Now we're going to factor out the greatest common factor. In our first grouping, we have an x that's common to both terms. So this becomes 2x plus 1. And then in our second grouping, you can look at that and say, oh, we have a 3 that's common to both terms. So we'll pull out a 3, and we have a 2x plus 1, and that's equal to 0. Now we're almost done. Let's go to our fourth step. Our fourth step says that we're going to factor out the common binomial, and then we'll solve for x. Our common binomial is this term and this term. So you know you've done the grouping right when you end up with a common binomial. Let's go ahead and let's factor that out. This is 2x plus 1. And then we have an x term from our first grouping left over. And then from our second grouping, we have a 3 left over. So we're going to add 3, and that's equal to 0. Now we have 2 equations to solve. We have 2x plus 1 is equal to 0, or we have x plus 3 is equal to 0. Let's do the one on the left first. I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides, so we get 2x is equal to negative 1. Then we'll divide by 2 on both sides, and we get x is equal to minus 1/2. Now let's look at the right. We'll subtract 3 from both sides, and we get x is equal to minus 3. Our solution is then x is equal to minus 1/2, or x is equal to minus 3. Let's do another example similar to this so that you can get the hang of this. This example is a little bit more difficult because we have a negative 8 as our constant. Let's begin by writing down our equation. We have 3x squared plus 10x minus 8 is equal to 0. Our first step is we're going to find two numbers that multiply to get a times c. So our a is 3, our c is minus 8, and that's minus 24. Now we have to find two numbers that multiply to get minus 24. Let's be systematic. Let's start with 1. So we have 1 and minus 24. And then over on the right, let's write down minus 1 and 24. And then we have 2 and minus 12. And then over on the right, we have minus 2 and 12. I really wish I knew this technique when I was learning how to do this. I remember sitting in class in middle school and trying to solve problems like this and just being so frustrated because I never knew which numbers to pick. Okay, I got sidetracked there. Let's continue. Our next number is 3. 3 goes into 24 minus 8 times. And then on the right, we can write down minus 3 and 8. And then we're going to have a 4. 4 goes into 24 6 times, so we have a minus 6. On the right, we have minus 4 and 6. 5 doesn't go into 24. 6 does, but we already have that, so we can stop. Now let's look at our middle term. Our middle term is 10x. So we need to find two numbers that add up to 10. Let's go through our list here. There they are right there. Those two numbers add up to 10. So those are the numbers that we're going to use for our grouping. So that's our second step. We are going to rewrite our middle term as a minus 2x plus a 12x. This gives us 3x squared minus 2x plus 12x minus 8 is equal to 0. Now let's do our grouping. That's our third step. Once you get used to doing this, you don't even have to remember what step was what. Now we're going to put a parenthesis around our first two terms and then around our last two terms. Now we're going to pull out the greatest common factor. In our first grouping, we can pull out only an x, so this leaves us with a 3x minus 2. And then in our second grouping, let's think about what number is common to both 12 and 8, and that's going to be 4. So we'll pull out a 4, and that leaves us with a 3x minus 2. And we know we've done it right because we see that we have a common binomial. Our last step is that we're going to factor that out. Let's factor out 3x minus 2. And then what we have left is we have an x and a 4. So let's write this as x plus 4 is equal to 0. And we're running out of room here, so let's head up over to this blank space. We're going to have two equations to solve. The first equation is 3x minus 2 is equal to 0, or we have x plus 4 is equal to 0. Let's solve the equation on the left first. I'm going to add 2 to both sides, so we get 3x is equal to 2. And then let's divide both sides by 3, and we get x is equal to 2/3. Now let's look at the one on the right. It's x plus 4 is 0, so I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, and we get x is equal to minus 4. Our solution is then x is equal to 2/3, or x is equal to minus 4. Hang with me, we have one more technique to look at. The last factoring technique that we're going to look at is called factoring perfect square trinomials. I wrote down some formulas here so that I can show you what a perfect square trinomial looks like. it looks like a squared x squared plus 2abx plus b squared is equal to ax plus b quantity squared. And that's because our first term and our last term are what we call perfect squares. The same thing happens in our second formula, except in this formula we have a negative, and that follows through on the right-hand side as well. I'll show you exactly how to use these formulas to factor quadratics. I have written down 3 steps that we can follow, and we'll go through these as we work through our example. Here's our first example. We are going to solve 4x squared plus 12x plus 9 is equal to 0. Our first step that you can see, I'll go ahead and highlight this up here, is to find a and b. A is going to be the square root of the number multiplying x squared. So that's the square root of 4. So our a is going to be equal to 2. Just make a note here that this 4 is just 2 squared. So our a is 2. And then our b is going to be the square root of our last term, which is 3. So you can just think of the 9 as 3 squared. Our second step, looking back again up above, is to check the middle constant. We want to make sure that the middle constant, and I'll highlight what that is in our problem, that's 12. We want to make sure that it is 2ab or minus 2ab. So let's go ahead and let's calculate 2 times a times b. So 2ab is 2 times 2 times 3. That's 4 times 3, which is 12. And that agrees with our middle term. So that means we can write our left-hand side as a perfect square. And we're going to do that right now. That'll be our step 3. That's using our formula. So let's look back up here at the green highlighted formula, and we're going to use this formula right here. Our problem then can be written as ax plus b quantity squared. Our a is equal to 2, so we have 2x plus b, which is 3, quantity squared, and that's equal to 0. Now we're going to solve 2x plus 3 is equal to 0. We'll move the 3 to the right-hand side, so we'll get 2x is equal to minus 3, and then we'll divide both sides by 2, and we'll get x is equal to minus 3/2. Now, here's where we have to be careful. Notice that in our problem, we had 2x plus 3 quantity squared. That means that we are going to get 2 roots. So the proper solution is going to be x is equal to minus 3/2 and minus 3/2. And that just tells us that we have what's called a repeated root. Let's now look at our next example. You may want to pause the video and see if you can do this one on your own. In this example, we are going to solve 9x squared minus 30x plus 25 is equal to 0. In the first step, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure we have a perfect square, and our a term is going to be the square root of 9, which is 3. That's a whole number, so we have a perfect square, and then our b is going to be square root of 25, which is equal to 5. Now let's go on to our second step. We have to make sure it's a perfect square. Notice that our middle constant is minus 30, so that's what we have to check now. Let's see if minus 2ab is in fact minus 30. We have minus 2, our a is 3, our b is 5. That's 15 times 2, and that's equal to minus 30. So that's good. Let me just highlight that so you can see that that matches our middle term. When this happens, we can now write our problem as a perfect square. Once you get used to doing some of these, you can probably not write down steps 1 and 2 and just do that in your head. I'm now going to write our left-hand side as a perfect square. This is going to be 3x. And then because we have a minus 30 as our middle term, we're going to have a minus here. And then our b, which is 5, squared is equal to 0. This is just solving 3x minus 5 is equal to 0. We'll add 5 to both sides, and we'll get 3x is equal to 5. Then we'll divide both sides by 3, and we'll get x is equal to 5/3. And don't forget, because we have a squared term, we're going to get 2 roots. So we're going to say 5/3, comma, 5/3. And that's our final answer. We did it. That was a lot of factoring techniques. Hopefully you feel more comfortable now knowing how to factor quadratics. I would suggest that you go through these problems, maybe try to do all of them again on your own, and maybe do some extra problems too. But now you have a solid foundation to work with.
If this video has been helpful to you, please consider subscribing to my channel. Keep believing in yourself and have a great rest of your day.